Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Rugenstein, co-director, along with Faye Anam Avis, of PEAK, Parents of Estranged Adult Kids. Today's video is about parental estrangement and suicide. Our guest is Michelle Snyder, a suicide prevention specialist. The purpose of this video is to help anyone who is involved in the PEAK movement, or anyone at all, to better understand how suicide can emerge as a considered solution to what feels like an intolerable psychological pain. Understanding this process can provide an emotional off-ramp to someone who's experiencing thoughts of suicide. To quote the CDC, the goal of intervention is to reduce factors that increase risk and increase factors that promote resilience. This too is the goal of PEAK. I hope you find today's video helpful. So I'm going to welcome today Michelle Snyder and Faye Avis to this discussion about suicide and what its meaning is to estranged parents. And so I'm going to ask each person, Michelle and Faye, to sort of introduce yourself to our audience and to just share a little bit about yourself and what your background is and what you're bringing to today's discussion. Let's start with Michelle.
Okay, morning or afternoon or whatever time it is. My name is Michelle Snyder, and I am the director of the Soul Shop movement. Soul Shop is an organization that works with faith communities to help leaders actively think about how they can equip their congregations to deal with suicide. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, have been a therapist for many years, and have a master's in divinity. So I bring a sort of faith element into that. But I've been doing suicide prevention in some form, both in the church and outside the church for 7 or 8 years now.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Faye, a lot of our people might already know you, but for those who don't, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Faye. I'm an estranged parent. I also have had experience with having suicidal thoughts. Actually, that stretched over a number of years. So I have experience with both of these things, and I've also done a lot of suicide awareness training in a variety of communities. So I'm the founder of PEAK and now the co-director of PEAK with Kelly.
Thank you, Faye. So today, as we sort of look at suicide, we're focusing in on estranged parents. And Faye, you have an intuition about the number of estranged parents that might have considered suicide as a way of sort of taking care of those awful, horrible feelings. Would you just sort of share what your intuition is about that?
Sure. So I think our experience with suicide and suicidal ideation, or people thinking about suicide, is that it's a kind of iceberg. And if you see, what you see on the surface, you can probably multiply that by 2 or 3 times, and that probably is more representative of what's really happening. So when you have a few people that make allusions to suicide, it's probably happening for more people than you can really see. Michelle, what's the number? It's what, 4 to 6% typically of adults in the United States are.
Yeah, general population is 6%.
Okay, so 6%. We know that in June of 2020 with COVID, 11% of Americans indicated they were considering suicide. I think as I work with estranged parents and listen to them, I think probably 1 out of every 3 estranged parents has had a period where they seriously considered suicide.
I would tend to agree with that from the clinical perspective of working with estranged parents now for 20 plus years, in that 1 in 3, I would go with that. I might even at times have guessed higher, but maybe 1 in 3 is close because it's safer to admit that in an office with one other person than it is in a group setting.
Yeah.
So it may be that I would sort of think it's higher than maybe 1 in 3. But again, this is an area that does not have enough research for us to be able to help estranged parents in particular. Every study that you read has a myriad of reasons why they believe these factors are associated with suicide, but not one of them lists estrangement. So we really don't know, and we really do need to know that for treatment purposes, for sure. Michelle, when we were talking a little bit earlier, you characterized, or you made a differentiation between depression and desperation, and I think that's an important distinction for parents and people who lead peak groups to understand. Would you share what that distinction is?
Yeah. So it's kind of a common misperception. We hear it a lot in suicide. Somebody dies by suicide, attempts suicide, and you'll hear people say things like, I just didn't even have any idea that person was depressed. And it's a very common kind of straight line that people want to draw. We know that actually the statistics, there's a couple different numbers that get tossed around, but the number is somewhere between 40 and 60% of people who die by suicide had major depressive disorder at the time of their death. But even that is a little bit reductionistic, I think. Living Works, which is one of the lead kind of owners of suicide prevention training materials, they use the image of the river of suicidal thinking. They say that a person is, when they're thinking about suicide, they're in this river. And they could be in the river for 5 minutes, or they could be in the river for 40 years, sort of trying to decide whether or not to end their life by suicide. And they say that river is fed by multiple contributaries. So it might be that major depressive disorder is one of the contributaries, but they would argue, and I think my experience absolutely concurs, that suicide is never about just one thing. It might be about a history of childhood trauma that is met with a major mental health disorder, which might be met with physical health problems, which might be met with relationship issues and financial problems. And it's this kind of synergy of these issues, or this intersection of these issues that create a world that either feels so overwhelmed or so despairing that they feel like death is the best option they've got. So we don't talk about very much in the suicide prevention work that I do. We don't really talk much about depression, because depression could be in the mix or isn't in the mix. We talk a lot about despair, because we find that that's a common thread among those who are in so much pain that death seems like their best choice. So we say, we quote a suicide prevention person, but we say people die by suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it basically comes down to a loss of hope and a loss of social connection. And hopelessness is really another way of talking about despair.
So I have a question, Michelle. Bringing that down to estranged parents, then what you're saying, I think, is that you can be an estranged parent and have gone through, the loss of relationship with your child, your grandchildren, have other losses going on, and be thinking about suicide without being depressed.
That is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. And if the research is any indication across the general population, it's quite common for that to be the case.
So that would really be applicable to our estranged parents, because if this estrangement comes out of the blue, which it usually does, although it may come in gradually, it's still a surprise when there's an actual cutoff, that desperation is introduced into this river, and there may not be a depression what'd you call it?
Contributory.
Contributory.
Yeah.
But the desperation is enough to tip the scale.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
So
exactly. And I think with suicide, that's what happens. Let's say someone's spouse dies and they attempt suicide. People say they attempted suicide because their spouse died. But the reality is that most of the time, if not all the time, there are multiple things that have added up to that moment, and tipping the scale is exactly the right word. It looks like it's the reason, but it's really the last straw, so to speak.
So Michelle, what do we know about suicide in this older population? We define, roughly the age of onset of estrangement is sometime early 50s, though sometimes younger. But we're talking about adults that are past what I call the 50-yard line. What do we know about suicide in middle to older adults?
Yeah, so if you're talking about middle adults, what we know is that suicide rates are actually highest. The very highest number of suicides in America are 45 to 65-year-old white men. So that gets up around the retiring age. People who are starting to move towards retirement, people who are experiencing empty nest, people who are beginning to face age discrimination, those kinds of things. Suicide rates for white women peak around age 50, and it's generally attributed to menopause and empty nest. Those are common contributaries. The second highest suicide rates after 45 to 65-year-old white men are 65 to 85-year-old white men. So really, once you hit 45, there's a peak for the middle-aged man, but it just tips off just a little bit. So that women attempt suicide more often, men actually die by suicide more often. So we've got a lot of people in that age range. It's kind of a common misconception that suicide is the biggest problem with suicide is in teenagers. It's where all the attention lay. But I often say people are really worried about kids in their communities dying by suicide, and they should be, because one youth suicide is too many. But the people in those communities who are at most risk are those kids' dads, followed by those kids' grandfathers. So we know that to be true. We also know that suicide attempts among older adults are more lethal. So for adolescents, I think you know this number, that there's one suicide for every, is it 100 or 200 attempts? Do you remember that number?
I don't.
It's at least 100.
200.
Is it 200? Okay. So for one suicide for every 200 attempts, for older adults, it's one suicide for every 5 attempts. So there's a lot more intentionality. There's a lot more lethality. There's a lot more planning. Those are a couple things we know.
Wow.
We also know that veteran suicide rates are very high. They bounce around a little bit, but basically the number that gets thrown around is 22 veteran suicides a day. And in our thinking, we go to Afghanistan, Iraq war, 22-year-olds. But those statistics are actually across the lifespan. So we're talking about Vietnam vets, but older adults also who were veterans have those higher suicide risks as well.
I think that's really important, because that we talk about seeing trauma symptoms in estranged parents similar to what we see in people returning from combat. And so because we believe we are dealing with trauma, I think we're seeing some of the same kind of phenomenon connection.
And you may have overlapping traumas, which are the multiple contributaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what I was going to say, Faye, was the trauma is the link. And so many estranged parents have said to us, once it's identified as trauma, like, wow, that is just what it feels like, whether they did not have the word or they had the word but felt like they were being over dramatic by labeling their reaction as trauma. And so it definitely is a trauma. That seems to be the common thread in the different populations of combat and estranged parents. And like you said, it could be layered. It could be maybe the first trauma was battle, and you come out in your mid to early 30s. You come home, you have to reculturate, you have to reintroduce yourself to your family in some cases. And so you're making a lot of changes, and then real life kicks in. And so there could be other losses that come down the road that just before you're even addressing the first trauma, if you are even addressing it, you've got life traumas that come in. And so the desperation kicks
Kelly,
in
I
at
would
some
take it even
point.
farther back. Look, we know there's also a correlation between adverse childhood experiences and
Oh,
suicide.
yes.
So
True.
you could have some childhood trauma. You know, at least today, people who go into the military often come from communities that are at higher risk for higher levels of adverse childhood experiences, and then the military trauma, and then the estrangement trauma. So yeah, compounding traumas.
Yeah, that is exactly right. So what I'm hearing as the three of us talk is not only is trauma the common thread that we're looking at, but I would dare say, although we haven't said these words exactly, that there is a tendency when you have these experiences to withdraw, to get away from your friends, not be out in public, and to really sort of hunker down for a lot of reasons. You know, you don't feel like anyone would understand what you're going through. In parental estrangement, being blamed for the estrangement is so common. The parent is at fault, supposedly. And additionally, not only are you supposedly the person who caused it, now you're the person who's supposed to fix it. And so that withdraw from society, from your friends, from any cultural events that you might enjoy going to is really put you in a place of real absolutely no support in some cases, which could be another contributory
Yeah.
leading into that.
Well, and I think that some, as a clinician, maybe outside my suicide prevention work, it's been a really helpful distinction for me to think about trauma as something that happens to us as opposed to something that's wrong with us. I think people who have trauma live with the belief that that means I'm broken. And we could talk about whether any of that's true, but I think trauma are these sort of external experiences that we have that when I hear people able to make the connection or make the distinction that this is not something that's fundamentally broken about me, this is something that wounded me externally. I think it takes on a different flavor, a different shape.
Yes, and I think that would be important for clinicians who are trying to help estranged parents to recognize as well about trauma in general, but also about estranged parents, because one of their lines of thinking is, what's wrong with me? What did I do wrong? I'm ineffective. All of those things that really just chip away at the self-esteem, which again can lead to more isolation and withdraw from everybody around you.
Brutal
Yeah,
story. Yep.
yeah, I think too. I think there's a kind of defectiveness orientation.
Yep.
Either I'm defective, and that doesn't feel good, or I get focused on my child and they're defective. You know, what they've done is proof of it. And what I really like about Kelly, some of the things I've heard you say, is we really need to focus not on the defectiveness of individuals, but there's something in the relationship that's broken. We need to focus on the brokenness in the relationship. And that's because the road to which one of us is defective or to what degree we're defective goes nowhere.
It literally goes nowhere, the bridge to nowhere.
Yeah.
It's Michelle, what I think I'm hearing with you is the same thing that we talk about in Peak, except you said it more eloquently than I have ever said it. And it was about isolation and hope. Do you want to say that again? I can't remember. It's about social connection. Hope, say that again.
Yeah, it's borrowed. I borrowed it from Faye, and Faye borrowed it from someone else. So
Okay.
we're not that eloquent. But the quote is that people die by suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it basically comes down to a loss of hope and a loss of social connection.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that is a message that we really push with our peak folks. When they come to us, many times they are still isolated, or they have such a tiny group of people that they can actually be open with, that they don't have the support nor the hope that they need to really address recovery from estrangement. They really haven't nurtured that. And while recovery is a process, it's made up of many parts that are, each a daily thing that's easily taken in and into our bones and tried to live differently. But let's take one step back before I say anything else about recovery. And when we take a look at people who have considered suicide and completed suicide, there is a factor that we reduce that to that person's depression or desperation, or some event that just happened in their life. And the systems approach would tell us that we need to look at a bigger picture to back up and see what else is here. And so you made a statement when we were talking earlier about the suicide statistics, and they're not going down. And then you connected that to community. Would you say that again?
Yeah. I don't know what I said, but what I believe, I'll tell you what I believe, is that, I mean, if we just trace it back, I have come to say people who die by suicide don't want to be dead. That's a very common kind of, I don't know, it's a common perception we carry around that's just not true. People who die by suicide don't want to be dead. People who die by suicide can't imagine living with the pain that they're in. They want to be out of the pain that they're in, and they can't see another way besides death to get out of it. So suicide is not about suicide. Suicide is about pain. And so if we just ask this question, what is it that is causing people so much pain? I think some of it are the things that we deal with, right? I mean, cancer is painful. Estrangement is painful. Financial issues, bankruptcy, scandal, arrest, all of that is painful. But what is compounding to that pain are communities that don't know how to provide community for for people who are in that kind of pain. It's communities that shun and shame and stigmatize whatever it is that's causing you pain, instead of embracing and accepting and providing community and solidarity in that pain. So I mean, almost exclusively, I take a public health approach to suicide that says it's the community's responsibility to create places where people can find comfort, relationship, hope, pathways to recovery, pathways to reinvention, pathways to normalization of the things that I'm dealing with, versus, I mean, just to use your context, if every single time an estranged parent walks into a church or, the Lions Club, somebody says, "Aren't your kids with you today? Why aren't your kids with you today?" Right? Like, the community is further stigmatizing, making a point of acknowledging all of those things, versus a community that can say, "We're so glad you're here. Do you want to come over for Christmas dinner? We'd love to have you." There's a way in which, I mean, that's a simple example, but I think we could hold our communities up to the light and look at the ways that we have created the unspeakable, and then we shame it. And I could talk about that in relationship to all kinds of things that pick a public health issue around which people are feeling despair, and you can attach to it a community that doesn't know how to absorb those people with love.
Well, so I'm going to maybe get a few people upset with this, but when we talk about the communities we need to have this sensitivity in, it's you named a couple of them, like some social things in the community, but there's in the church, but there are clinicians, there's doctors, there's lawyers, there's elder care folk that don't know how to respond, or in many cases are not even asking if the parent is dealing with estrangement from a loved one, especially a child. And so by not asking that question, I think that stigmatizes it even further. I mean, when you look back in our culture, think of all the things that are now mentioned in television commercials that we never would talk about before because it was stigmatizing. And now we talk about them. And the
Yep.
only reason that they are now being talked about is because they have been normalized as human foibles or human situations that we have to deal with every day that nobody wants to talk about. First one that comes to mind with me is toilet paper. It used to be Mr. Whipple squeezing the Charmin because it was so soft and comfortable, but we're not going to say anything else about that. And now they have little dancing bears wiggling their tushies around with toilet tissue flying around in the air. And so you can take that to so many places. That's all been destigmatized as far as, can we talk about this? And so I think that it's important for us to look at the community aspect and what do we look at as stigmatizing, or a group that we really can't talk about that here.
Yeah. So one statistic that isn't necessarily about this demographic, but I think is helpful, is around gay and lesbian youth. Suicide rates are particularly high around for LGBTQ entirely, but for LGB, the suicide rates are highest before they come out. And so suicide rates for gay and lesbian people, adolescents, drop almost back to the general population once they're out of the closet, because it's not about it. Primarily what it's about is the fear of loss of community, the thing that we can't talk about, this closet that they live in. And then once they come out and they name it, they may be ostracized by some. The general population can't always deal with certain things, but when they're able to find a community of people who can, it lowers their suicide risk. And I would guess that's true across all kinds of issues that people deal with.
Yeah.
Sorry, Faith.
I hear you saying, Michelle, that it's interesting because the things that get stigmatized are the very same things that are factors in suicide.
Yes, I am saying that.
So whether you're talking about parental estrangement, we don't talk about that in faith communities, or divorce a little bit more, but that still creates issues. Doesn't get talked about. Legal problems. When someone's arrested, I think their suicide risk goes up a factor of 5. These are things we don't talk about. We don't talk about church and saying, now, there may be some of you that got arrested this week. There are many people with criminal records as with college educations. So these folks are around us, and these are the very things that contribute to suicide, that are also the things that we don't talk about, that are hard to talk about. And parental estrangement is one of those.
So really, the coming out of isolation, whether it's totally on your own or whether you belong to a community that's sensitized, really reduces stress and distress and increases our resilience. Just by giving the statistic that you just quoted about the LGBTQ community and what happens when you come out of isolation. Yeah. So that the resiliency alone is a gift to give yourself. And I just want to mention that all of this, as we talk about it, is the coming out of isolation piece is one of the very, if not the very first thing Peak encourages estranged parents to do, is to come out of isolation. It may be joining a Peak group, long-term staying in your Peak group. The things that Faye and I have heard from our people in groups over the past couple of years is really encouraging, and hopeful and hope giving, which are two of the things that you talked about being really important. Is
And
there
again, I'm
any-
wondering if our message isn't, there is this initial shot or infusion of connection and hope. And then maybe part of the message is, so we need you just to give it more time. I mean, from a theological standpoint, you think about Peter and Judas. So what's the difference between those two? Well, Peter stuck around, right? He stuck around long enough to be, to experience some sense of redemption, and Judas didn't. But there's probably also some statistics about that, Michelle, about if people just, in some cases, have a little more time to think about it instead of having a, when the means is right there, have time to think about it. Is there any research about just how sometimes buying a little time helps?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we say means matter. That's kind of the tagline. There was a recent study that came out that I think kind of rocked the community. It's been a little bit controversial. I think it's right that they interviewed post-suicide they interviewed suicide attempt survivors, and 50% of them said that they gave less than 1 hour of thought to their suicide attempt before they made it. For 25%, it was 10 minutes, and another 25%, it was 1 hour. So what's been controversial, I think, is just the need to name that doesn't mean they didn't have suicidality that has been more long-term. They may have been in that river of suicide for 20 years,
Right.
but 50% of people woke up on the morning of their suicide attempt and didn't know they were going to attempt suicide. And it says something about, you talk about the scale tipping. It says something about how sort of in an instant, something can be the precipitating event that tips the scale and makes a person experience such desperation that death seems like the best option. And so with that kind of impulsivity comes the choice in front of you, which is either made easier because you've got a bottle of pills right in front of you, or made harder because you don't have a bottle of pills right in front of you. And so, yeah, they say putting time and space between a person and their means can save a life. Because that level of distress, that acute, severe level of distress, can often pass. I compare it actually to substance abuse, and I say, people who are alcoholics don't want to drink equally at all times. It's worse when you're hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. And when you're hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, and you've got a bottle of whiskey on your counter, you're much more likely to relapse than if you live in a dry county and you don't have access to a liquor store. So we, yes, I think that's absolutely right, Faye. I think that means matter, and giving people the time to breathe it out, call a friend. I mean, it's not a lot different than 12 steps. Get a sponsor, call somebody who can remind you of your worth, call somebody who can remind you how hard you've worked, call somebody who can say, this is a normal response, but suicide isn't your only choice. So yeah, Kelly, I'm hearing you talk about community and getting in a peak group and staying in a peak group, and it resonates with the way we talk about suicide, that we say hope can take a while to restore. When you feel despairing, those are complicated things that are not going to be fixed overnight, but community can be restored pretty quickly. And in suicide, one of the ways that we do that is we start with listening to people, just sort of humanizing them. But when we ask people the question about suicide, one of the ones we teach, and is our favorite, is to say to a person, sometimes people going through what you're going through start to thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? And we find that that even the way we ask that question is connecting. It creates community. It gives people a sense that, oh, this is a pretty normal response. Just like we've kind of gotten away from saying post-traumatic stress disorder because it's not disordered to have trauma after, after trauma to have stress. It's not abnormal to think about suicide when you're dealing with so many multiple contributaries. And so it's kind of a normal thing that people just like you experience, and you're part of a much larger community of people. It can diffuse a lot for people to be told you're one of many instead of you're the only one thinking or feeling this way.
Yeah, I quote Margaret Atwood in an interview. She said a lot of things that I can't remember, but the one thing she said that I do remember is when you have hope, you do something.
Mm.
I think the other thing, Michelle, I heard you say that makes a lot of sense, and I use this. I think you say something like, suicide's a number on the pain scale.
Yeah.
And so when somebody is suggesting in their language that they're thinking, whether they're thinking about suicide or not being alive or whatever, my response to them tends to be, that tells me how much pain you're in.
Yeah.
You're in a lot of pain right now. So let's talk about that. So it becomes I don't go straight into a conversation about an intervention plan unless that's indicated. But I just use it as, wow, hopefully that makes them feel visible.
Yeah.
Their pain becomes visible.
I think it is it's a pretty common barrier around suicide. People are very afraid of that word, and it's high stakes, it's high risk, like lives are at stake.
Right.
And there are some issues of liability, but
Right.
but the reality is that if suicide is mostly a number on a pain scale, then we're not talking about suicide, we're talking about pain. And I was at a training last week, and somebody said, I'm just afraid to get it wrong. And and I said, I don't know that there's a wrong way for a caring human being to listen to another human being talk about their pain. I think there are things we can say that are better and worse and more and less helpful, and there's tips and tools and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, if what we understand that we're doing is being people who care about each other, who are listening to each other talk about their pain without judgment, I think it gets us really far. Yeah.
Kelly, you talk about one of the things I really appreciated about what you said, Kelly, about trauma. We talk about how difficult reconciliation is, and in many cases, how unlikely an outcome it is. Things that you've said, Kelly, is, but we have lots of reason to believe that people who are dealing with trauma can get better. There's lots of research to suggest they can get better. And that early on was a hopeful message to me. Like it doesn't have to always be this way. You can feel better. It doesn't feel that way now, but we just need you to give it some time and work in this process, and you will feel better. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for the time today. I'm sure that this will be helpful to a lot of people just to understand more fully the role that it plays, but the role that we can play in community, as individuals, as people who are peak people. So I'm hoping that the message that we share today is really helpful for a lot of folks.
Can I say something about the suicide prevention hotline?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So when somebody's an imminent threat to themselves or someone else, or having a suicide crisis and you run up against a wall and don't know what to do, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline is a really valuable resource. You may have seen it on billboards. It's kind of all the rage right now. We just got a 3-digit code passed. So the number is And you call that number just like you would call 911. When you call that number, it gets routed back to local resources. So even though it's a national hotline, national number, you'll get put in touch with somebody in a community near you who knows the resources in your community. You can also text to that line. 988 is also a text line. So for people who are more comfortable texting, that can be a useful resource as well. And it can also be used for people who are helping someone who might have thoughts of suicide, who don't know what to do. It isn't just like a 911, you better have an emergency. I have called on several occasions and said, I'm in this situation, not sure what to do. Can you help me think it through? And they're happy to do that as well. So it's a good resource and people should know about it.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll be sure to include that in the comments that are below here, as well as on the screen when I edit this. So thank you again. Thank you both. This has been wonderful.
Thanks for what you do.
Thank you.
Yay.